Good afternoon. My name is Carl Adrian. On behalf of TRIDEC, I want to welcome you all today. Last evening, I had a chance to spend some time with our speaker, and I'm convinced that this is going to be a very interesting presentation today, so I'm glad to see the great turnout. And he's... But before we introduce the speaker, I do want to thank our sponsors for today's event. You know, events like this just don't happen, and we need sponsors. And so we appreciate Battelle. They've got a table down here for being a sponsor today. They're our premier sponsors, so thank you very much, Battelle. And also our bronze sponsor, Fluor and Vista Engineering. So please join me in thanking those sponsors. As is customary, I'd like to also recognize the elected officials that are with us today. From Congressman Doc Hastings' office, we have Barb Liss, the district director. Barb, would you stand and maybe hold your applause if we could get... Sorry. It's just I couldn't see over the screen. From the 8th Legislative District, Representative Brad Klippert is here. I think Brad checked his firearms at the door, didn't you, Brad? No. From Benton County, Commissioner Leo Bowman. From Franklin County, I think Commissioner Brad Peck is here. At least I saw his name tag out there. From the Kennewick, from the city of Kennewick, Mayor Steve Young is here, I know, and Councilman Don Britton, and also Marie Mosley, who's the city manager. From the Richland City Council, Mayor John Fox. I saw John earlier is here. Councilman Phil Lemley, and also Councilman Bob Thompson is here. I see Bob down here, right? From the Port of Benton, they're having a commissioners meeting because they're all three here. No, they're not. Jane's not here. Okay. Commissioner Roy Keck and Commissioner Bob Larson are down here. From the Port of Kennewick, Commissioner Gene Wagner is here. From Benton PUD, Lori Sanders. And from Franklin PUD, Bill Gordon and Stu Nelson are here. So please welcome our elected officials. Thank you. In a minute, I'm going to ask Mike Lawrence, who's chairing our Mid-Columbia Energy Initiative, to introduce our speaker. And I know Mike's has a history with FIX, so this will be a good introduction. But first, I want to put today's topic in a little bit of context. Even before we began our work to grow the energy sector of the local economy through the Mid-Columbia Energy Initiative, people approached TRIDEC numerous times since I've been here and said, what's TRIDEC doing about nuclear? Or shouldn't TRIDEC be doing something about nuclear? And then the acronyms, FFTF and GNEP and FMEF and all these acronyms around facilities or programs that are nuclear related. You know, one question our speaker asked last night to a small group at dinner was, is nuclear a religion or is it a business? And I think if I asked the room here, I think we'd have a split vote regarding whether it's religion or business. But I think that's why TRIDEC has had so many questions about what are we doing or what should we do. So we've suggested all along that our Mid-Columbia Energy Initiative is really about a suite of energy alternatives and how to grow the energy sector of the economy. And I think probably the only form of energy that's not on the table right now is coal. But last summer, we asked Mike Lawrence to assemble a small group of local experts in the area in the nuclear field. And the purpose was, I'll say, to evaluate all things nuclear for this community. And what is the answer to the question, should the Tri-Cities pursue anything nuclear and as a potential job creator? And if so, what were the areas that were most promising in that process? And I'll say from our standpoint, it was a heavy emphasis on economic development, just not the technology or not the form of energy and that sort of thing. But it was really what is going to create the most jobs for the community. After a couple months, and I think it was a couple months of meeting every other week, and that group going through a very strenuous process of looking at different alternatives, the recommendation came up with two that they felt was most promising. One was isotope production, not just medical, but also industrial isotopes. And the second was small modular reactors. So today we're here to get one perspective on small modular reactors. You know, again, this is the disclaimer from TRIDEC standpoint. You know, SMRs are part of a suite of energy alternatives that I think the community needs to look at, but it's one that seems very promising at this time. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike Lawrence, again, who's chairing our Mid-Columbia Energy Initiative, and many of you know Mike from his days at either PNNL or Department of Energy, to come up and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, and thanks for this great turnout. It's really wonderful to have so many and so broad and diverse a group here for Vic to see, so we can see the strong interest and support within the community. Vic is a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary back in Washington, D.C. And as such, it's obviously a very important position, both for DOE but also for this community, given that all that they do and the money that comes to this community from the Department of Energy. Vic is one of those people who, when you look at his resume, you realize there's no way I can go through all of this. And so I just wanted to pick out just a couple of the highlights of his resume before him coming up and giving his presentation. Vic got his master's at Rensselaer, his bachelor's at Rensselaer, his master at Yale, and his PhD from Princeton, and then followed it with a stint at MIT's Lincoln Labs. And so clearly we have a person here today with the technical chops to talk about things nuclear energy, and how our energy future, and he's certainly proven that. Another one of the positions that Vic has held in his career back in government was as director of the famed DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Agency, and all of the innovation that they have done. And of course, that has now spawned the energy equivalent of DARPA. And clearly, that shows his management skills for R&D with a long-range focus and long-range benefits for the community. And then the first time I met Vic was back in the early 90s when he was the Assistant Secretary for Defense Programs. And although I know a number of you may be familiar with that, for those of you who are not, that is the person and that is the responsibility within the government which has to advise the President on the safety and security of the nuclear stockpile. Now, I really can't think of any government position whose consequences and importance is quite as important as that. And yet that's what Vic had to do. And he had to do it at a time, as you'll hear in his talk, when there was a comprehensive test ban. And how do you do that without the ability to test? And Vic will talk to you about that. But probably, maybe the most noteworthy accomplishment that Vic has is he's been married to his wife for 56 years. And perhaps that's more of an accomplishment for his wife than it is for Vic. But that's quite an accomplishment. So just two more points. The first is Vic is a real data junkie. He's a systems analyst, and as you will see, he doesn't just talk about a problem. He understands it thoroughly and cranks all the numbers himself to make sure he understands it. And last, and again, you will see this in his presentation, he is very proficient at PowerPoint and a real aficionado. So I'm sure you will be entertained by his presentation as well as well-informed. Please welcome Vic Reis.
Good. Yeah, how did I learn how to do PowerPoint? I was head of the program, the weapons program, and as such, I had about 40,000 people working for me, many of whom could do this. And then one day, Secretary Richardson said goodbye, and that was on a Friday. And Monday, I sort of said I had nobody at all, so I had to learn PowerPoint. And what I discovered was nobody, the people who you learn at, they don't know how to do it right. So I decided to sort of do it slightly differently myself. So so you said this is, and I noticed you've got the brochure came out. So I said we want to fix that a little bit. So the first thing you want to do is put a small modular reactor on the, basically on the site there. And what I'll try to convince you, of course, is that in turn really dominates things. So this just isn't one of N, and all N are good, but this is sort of number one of N, and so that's the message I want to give here. Now, we started off this whole idea of Sputnik being, if you will, energy being a Sputnik moment was a question that Secretary Chu raised. Is the energy race our Sputnik, basically our Sputnik moment? And that is a good question. It was picked up by President Obama in his. Isn't that great? You see, that was Sputnik. I don't know if many of you are probably too young to remember that, but I'll get those. So he said, "Hey, look, why that's important is, as you can see, what the president said. You know, the Soviets beat us to this to Sputnik. It really was." Really very important in getting the country, you know, basically getting the country together in terms of that threat. So he's saying, NASA didn't exist. We put all this organization together, but it really created, if you will, in many respects, the space race, which we won. And he's saying, look, this is something that's genuinely bipartisan, right? You know, Democrats like this, Republicans like this. And we have to really think about it in that way. And maybe, in fact, if we get everybody together, energy can be the Apollo project, if you would, of this, basically, of this generation. So let's go back now, give you a little history. I should point out this president made a serious mistake. This isn't recorded, right? Yeah, blank that part off when the science wasn't even there yet. The science has been there for several hundred years. That's the science was Isaac Newton and Lavoisier really did the science. It was but it was the spirit of innovation and engineering that really worked here. So this is what happened. I'm going to produce if you will, a strategic planning perspective on that, and then use that perspective to discuss where small modular reactors eventually play. There it is again. That was October 4th, 1957. I actually remember it. And then the perspective is, okay, that was an event that caused something majorly to happen. And of course, the president at the time with the vision was President Eisenhower. And he said, boy, we've really got to do something about this. We just can't let it happen. Well, he, in fact, created DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Agency, which I had the honor to run, some 20 or so years later, actually 30 years later. Notice, that was October, he started a whole new organization, and by February, he did more than that. He started NASA in July. That's him signing the authorization or the bill to start NASA. At what point, however, he decided that would be a civilian agency. It would be primarily all civilian. DARPA was a military, so he got them basically out of the business. Then came, they got going, that's Yuri Gagarin, for first man in space. That was in April of 1961. What people forget, of course, was that a few days later was the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the country was going through enormous turmoil, and how does one basically deal with that? And Mike didn't mention, but I also worked in the White House, not then, but some years later, as an assistant for the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and had the opportunity to go back and look at a lot of the memo. You can imagine there were a lot of memos flying back and forth. Now what do we do? And of course, the thing that we actually decided to do was, in fact, go to the moon and come back, okay, within 10 years. That's really important. And that of course, was the strategy that allowed NASA. I also worked at NASA for a while, not much longer than that. Let me tell you, that was project 1, 2, the priorities were very, very clear. That was really important. That helped focus and align that whole organization to that particular timely goal. So I'm going to try to make that. And of course, the result of was very successful. There's, Neil Armstrong on the moon. But this was really a Cold War strategy, even though it was all done as part of it was all a civilian aid. There were no secrets. It was all very open. That was part of it. It was a Cold War strategy. So next time then is now, Mike mentioned, is wait a minute, I found myself in that position of when President Clinton announced that we're going to maintain our nuclear deterrent while we're going to try to do this without nuclear testing. And, oh, by the way, we'll figure out some other way to do that. And, of course, he didn't say exactly how to do that. But that, in turn, was my job. And, in fact, that was the vision. That was presidential vision. So the question was, how do you create a strategy? And then how do you make it into a timely goal? So what I did at the time was I worked with the three laboratories, in the 3 weapons laboratories. I actually visited it out here, because the place where, we're part of that as well. Los Alamos, Livermore, Sandia. And the strategy was pretty clear. If you can't test it, you've got to simulate it, but the simulations has to be valid. So each of the laboratories went and had to do a major experiment that was technically equivalent, if you will, to testing in some sense. That became, so Livermore at the National Ignition Facility, Mesa was a production complex that developed special units at Sandia, and Los Alamos had actually 2. One was the accelerated production of tritium, which later didn't go, but also the dual axis radiographic. So they each had a Nordstrom at the mall, because in a laboratory, as you know, it isn't a question of just having a lot of things. You need a big project. That's the way the DOE laboratories worked. But they also had to do the computing, and in each case, then we worked very closely with the leading computer manufacturers at the time, and each laboratory worked with them. So each laboratory would have an experiment, each laboratory would have a computer, and we had to develop that. Now, it turned out that to do that, you had to, when we looked at what the goal was, you had to produce something like a computer of like 100 teraflops, and without getting into that. That was about a factor of 10,000, more than we had available at the time. So that meant we had to do a major improvement working with in terms of the computing business. And then, of course, the question was, how do you do that? When do you need to have that? All right, that's a picture of again, the laboratories figured out, that's a picture of Charlie McMillan, who's now the director of Los Alamos. And then I just sort of arbitrarily, that's it, you can do these things, you think there's a lot of analysis. I said, well, 10 years sounds like a good number, because 10 years, though, also was when that's a picture of Seymour Sack, it's when the people who were the major designers of the current weapons who'd been through the testing, they could also validate it. All right, so it wasn't a question of just putting the numbers together, you had to have the right people, because ultimately this is a judgment call. And so you had to have the people that people trusted to be able to say, yep, this basically really works. And then the other part was the politics. This is Hazel O'Leary, many of you remember, was the Secretary of Energy at the time. And then this was the Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, John Shalikashvili, and of course Congress. This was Pete Domenici, and I was fortunate enough I had worked with Bill Perry and John Shalikashvili in my role in the Defense Department. So you pick up the phone, this is Vic, this is John. You can basically make those connections. So they trusted me, I trusted them to put this story together. What happened was, of course, it worked. This is the Congress had them look at this. They had Jim Schlesinger, good friend of Mike Lawrence's, and Bill Perry again. They wrote this report saying, hey, this turned out to be even more successful than people had, suggested. Just like, you said, you hope this is a fairly interesting talk, And so it turned out that, I expected it to be remarkably successful. I don't know why people didn't turn basically to do this. But you say, well, what happened? Well, for one thing, nuclear weapons are all within the government. There is no commercial nuclear weapon, at least we hope not, commercial nuclear weapons business. We could define the problem pretty well, and we could actually put timely goals. We have to have 100 teraflops that's validated by this particular date. So having a goal is when you're building a program, as you know, it really helps define what the program is. We're able to align, and that's the strategy here, relevant institutions, presidential urgency, that stayed with it. You had world-class laboratories, you had commercial spin-offs. Okay, the commercial companies that were involved, IBM, Intel, and so forth, they were not in it. I mean, part of it was patriotic, of course, but they did not lose money on this. They said, if we can do this, there's going to be a very large commercial spin-off. IBM, just to make that case, when they started, if you pick the top 500 fastest computers, at the time, there were none of them were IBM. Okay, now around the world, 40 or 50% of them are IBM. So they were able to see, the CEO was able to say, this is part of my business plan, as well as basically doing that. And again, we had a DoD partner, and there was a lot of money in this, and that money was sustained, okay, through a long, administrations came, went, Republicans, Democrats, that money was basically sustained. And, in addition, again, to the nuclear weapons, this is the high-performance computing. This is the fastest computer in the world. That's what was driven. You'll notice there's a change in the slope when we got started. So that was indeed the case. This is President Obama giving the president of IBM the medal of the technology medal last year. Neither of them, of course, had anything to do with either of that, but they showed up in time. They showed up in time, and I'm hoping maybe some of you might not just be showing up, that you'll have something to do with this creation as well. Okay, so here's something, again, those were the things that worked. I left the department. The Secretary of Energy, the deputy, asked me to come back to help put something together that became Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, and indeed, this whole area was participated somewhat, basically in that. So let's look at the model. What's the presidential vision? What's the strategy? What's the timely goal? Well, the president, indeed, this is a radio address. That's an actual picture of President Bush saying what this was basically all about. We're going to have this partnership. We're going to work with all these countries. It's really innovative reactors and fuel cycles, because the issue really was, how do I deal with a fuel cycle? When we looked at it, it says, well, wait a minute, the current reactors are not doing, let's get fast reactor, FFT, this is something you folks are, this was your bread and butter, if you will, basically, to do that. But it was a national security issue. It was driven by the fact that there's enriched uranium, plutonium, you want to close the fuel cycle, and you want to work with other countries. So it was really a national security issue as well as an energy issue. The strategy was, again, advanced reactors, advanced fuel cycles, global partnership, get everybody to work together. Sounded pretty good, except we were never able to put together what's the timely goal. Okay, when do you have to do this? When you look at, well, is that going to be 50 years, 75 years, things take a lot longer. The other part that we really failed is that, we did not engage the U.S. utilities. This was a government issue. It was a government thing. The utilities were we told them about it later. Well, they're a major player if you're going to be doing all this. And we didn't really interact terribly well with the U.S. spent fuel policy, which was it was a government issue. So this is what happened, and then the program died. Okay, now, parts of it are still around, but fundamentally the program died. So what happened? Why did that was the case? Well, this is the way we sort of set it up. There were going to be large reactors, light water reactors. There was going to be interim storage. It was going to go into Yucca Mountain. The guts of the program was really in that fast future, if you will, recycling systems. Everybody's going to join in around the world, and we were going to have, if you will, a fuel bank, all right, for fuel leasing. I mean, this is something that really every president has sort of supported some type of fuel leasing. Goes back to, Atchison, Lilienthal, and Baruch. So everybody kind of likes this idea. You went around and talked to all the people around the world. They all liked it too. Oh, small modular reactors. Well, they were there, but they were there for, they said, well, we can make these, but these are primarily for export purposes, for countries whose grid can't deal with a gigawatt. What happened? Well, and this is a private group. We don't have to do, right? Interim, got to the president, and the president's legislative person said, Mr. President, you can't support interim storage until until we really got Yucca Mountain essentially done. You promised in some campaign speech. I said, okay, well, whoops, interim storage. Well, it's very hard to take back, all right, if there's no place to put it. Nobody here so, well, wait a minute, no. So that disappears. Okay, well, wait a minute, then we're not going to, small modular reactors kind of disappeared in all of that, and then Congress said, wait a minute, why are you doing this future, R&D program around the world? We're not going to basically support that. Then we hired Mike's friend, Dennis Spurgeon, to put this together, and of course Dennis is first said, well, we got to do interim storage. I said, sorry, Dennis, that's not. So he said, okay, let's do the best we can. Let's look at current reprocessing system, right? Let's get energy solutions. Let's see if we can upgrade the current systems to be able to do that. Well, there just wasn't enough, frankly, political support and money to be able to do that. So, and then to top this all off, of course, this administration came in and said, well, we're not going to do Yucca Mountain. All right, so in a way, this is a clean slate. We basically start from scratch. And then what happened then is, again, these are people you're probably familiar with. A couple of, almost 2 years ago now, Pete Miller and Pete Lyons, who was head of the nuclear energy, said, hey, we were doing this Nuclear Power 210 program, which actually turned out to be very successful. It got the AP10. Can we do that for something like that for small modular reactors? The Office of Management Budget said, no, you can't. And so they came to me and said, look, you've done all this, President. Can you put together a story that why small modular reactors are useful and be able to make the case for Office of Management Budget to help us get a program started? Well, by now you should get it, right? This is how you do strategic planning. You start off with a presidential vision, you put together a strategy, you put together a timely goal, and you get it. If you don't have that, chances are you're not going to get it. So I had to start. Well, I didn't have, I don't have a president talking about small modular reactors, but if you look back, if you look back the president's speech in Prague, which was a national security speech, he brings in nuclear reactors as part of climate. He's beginning to basically put together. So I said, okay, let's start to do that. And if you read all the things that they were talking about, it was very heavily oriented towards climate, clean energy, energy security, competitiveness, national security in terms of non-proliferation. Those were government basically national goals. The strategy now, however, was what we were unable to do in GNEP was to align the U.S. electricity sector from their goals. How do you do that in terms of something different? Consumers want electricity to be extraordinarily reliable at a reasonable price. Utilities and the generators and so forth all have to earn, for the most part, they have to, they've got investors. They have to respond back. Regulators are really concerned, NRC, in terms of the safety. There's the grid, okay, and then there's the industrial base. How can you put something together to make that alignment takes place? And then what is the timely goal? Well, moving ahead, the president gave us a timely goal because he said, in his 2000 State of the Union address, he said by 2035, 80% of all electricity will come from clean energy sources. All right, let's see if you can now put together, if you will, a strategy that makes some sense. And then, of course, I get started on this. First thing that happens is the election changes, right? And the climate is no longer a political strong point. Let me just say that at that point again. So I can't be talking, okay, well and indeed, the day after the election, the president says, wait a minute, how do we get our nuclear going, because that might be an area where the Republicans and Democrats can basically work together, for clean energy and energy independence or that sort of thing. Well, then of course, all of a sudden, natural gas comes, I won't say roaring, but it suddenly comes back on the picture very, very quickly at, instead of $8, $3 or $2. And indeed, one of the Secretary of Energy's advisory board subcommittees, chaired by John Deutsch, said, "Hey, you can do this safely. This is, what are the environmental?" He says, if you do it right, you can do this basically safely. So that's some serious competition, for restarting nuclear. And then, of course, comes Fukushima with the safety. And I was actually giving a talk on small modular reactors at a big meeting in Dallas in the American Physical Society. I was on my way down there. Fukushima happens. I called back. Are we still, do we still like nuclear? I mean, is that, because I was the only federal employee, there, it's like, oh, no, we're still in it. I mean, they said, yep, no, this is really important. So the question I'm now asking is, okay, now where does SMRs fit into this whole picture? And what I'm suggesting is, and we can, if we have time, we'll discuss that in terms of your views. Hey, maybe that's the Sputnik moment, because everybody's now stopping and thinking about that. Okay, where is reactors, where is nuclear reactors, where are small reactors playing in that? In fact, maybe the small modular reactors are the Apollo, okay, for the energy business. It could be that big, okay? So, now, one thing was nice. This is Secretary Chu's, that's him on the bicycle. He takes this clean energy stuff seriously. Do you ride a bike, Mark, to work? You do, right? You don't work anymore. No, he doesn't work. He rides a bike. All right, so that's right. So this is an article that he wrote this is an op-ed that he put together for the Wall Street Journal back in March of 2010. He gets it. He really does. He keeps insisting. He really gets it when I pester him. This is technology to build reactors with American workers, competition, right? That's what you were talking about earlier. That's what TRIDEC is, this is right in your sweet spot, right? This is what you're all about. But, hey, modular construction can reduce the costs. What's the problem? Why, Mark, why aren't you buying a lot of these? They cost too much. All right. I mean, you have to make, you want to give your customers, electricity at a reasonable price. And if these things cost too much, you can't do it. This is a potential way of really reducing the costs and on-site replacement of aging. So that's basically what's the market? And then again, so U.S. competition, cost, flexibility, market, and also for retiring coal plants. Also, I would add, he didn't discuss it at this time, but we'll talk about what does that mean in terms of global proliferation. Where does that fit in? Well, let's start off by looking at the 80% clean energy standard. No one exactly knows what that means, but, the first approximation, coal is 1 unit, natural gas is a half. If you talk to our people who are worrying about CCS, they'll say, hey, we can probably get it at 10%. Right, so let's use that. Well, this is where we are now. In terms of, you use that as your rule, this is the EIA, the Energy Administration, that's the data. We're at 42% clean energy in this country. I don't know what the region is here, but over this country, this is 42%. They project where we're going to be in 2035. It's 43%, so it's gotten a little bit cleaner, but not much, right? So it says, if you're talking 80%, how are you going to be able to do this? So I said, well, all right, let's assume the government meets all their goals in terms of solar, in terms of wind, in CCS becomes on board. So I just put some numbers together, and that's what you end up with. And you can make it, but all of a sudden, you'll notice, and by the way, you get your licenses of the current reactors are renewed. Okay, so everything works. You're still 1,000 terawatt hours short. I'm saying, okay, that's the role for our small modular reactors. replacing coal, okay, but you need a lot, and you have to go fast if you're going to meet that. Now, you may say, well, we don't quite meet it or something. That's okay, but you're going to need a lot. That puts you, that says I can't invest in new R&D, no new inventions. I pretty much have to go with light water reactors, low enriched uranium. Something might come along, but the first approximation, that's where basically we're going to start. Now, does 10 gigawatts sound like an awful lot per year? But actually, it's been done before, right? A couple things, So you can see even back in even after 3 Mile Island, when these things came on, 10 gigawatts was indeed on, several years. So that's not absolutely out of the question. You also notice how much new natural gas is being put on. That's capacity. Remember, that's not. You have to turn them off and turn them on. A lot of that is peaking. Okay, so this is kind of what you working into. Now the question is, how do I align? I've got national goals written, right? The president said national goals, when I want to do it. How do I align the civilian sector? So there are, this is John Rowe. I've spoken to him, he's the president of Exelon. He gave a talk to the American Nuclear Society. He says, hey, nuclear is a business, not a religion. No, it is and it isn't, depending upon, where you've grown up. Nonetheless, from the perspective of a company that has to do that, it's a business. If they can't make a business, it doesn't matter how much they love it, that's not a success. Where are we now? You all know this. 104 reactors, 100 gigawatts, 800 terawatt hours, last groundbreaking in 1957. What is the strategy of the current utilities? This is, again, that might be a little different, but hey, it's a culture of prudence, right? They're not going to want, this is not where you go out and do experiments. You want to be sure, so prudence is really important in what you're doing. So what's the strategy? Maintain the current reactors, keep that extraordinary ability to run these things. They really are. It's just amazing how well they're done. Extend the life of the current reactors, and oh, by the way, they'll buy a new one when and if it turns out to be licensed and cost competitive. And that's what we're, Southern has been able to, start with one, but that's basically where we are. Where is the government in all this? Well, it's kind of a mixed history. There's multiple agencies involved, spent fuel, safety, security, environment, proliferation, all the things these are going, and it's a mixed history, right? Sometimes we're in, sometimes we're out. Dominated, I would argue, over the past 20 years or so by Yucca Mountain. Everything we did does this fit Yucca Mountain or not? And guess what, right? Now Yucca Mountain is gone. It's produced, the Blue Ribbon Commission produced, I think, a pretty good report, frankly, explained what the problem was, where are you going to go, and said maybe the Department of Energy is actually not the best place to, basically to do this. In the meantime, however, we have had a successful Nuclear Power 210 program, which was cost share, design certified a license. That program is over. Then potentially loan guarantees, that's program is, there have been some, one, right? And then continue to do R&D on advanced concepts. That's where the laboratories, if you will, play. That's basically what that strategy is. Again, that, with the key to passive safety that was successful in getting the AP, the AP 1000 licensed, and the other, the ESPR that'll probably come along pretty well. So that's a successful model, and indeed that's the model that we've chosen for the DOE's SMR, Small Modular Reactor Program. So indeed, we're in the process of that. Well, what does that mean for aligning, utilities, right? This is a MIT report says, yeah, once it's economically competitive, it can play, potentially can play. They put some numbers together. They look pretty reasonable. This is where we were. This was in 2007 dollars. Nuclear is to, cost more than, than coal, and in terms of levelized cost. And unless you had very high levels for natural gas, you were not competitive there as well. So the strategy originally was, well, okay, let's put a carbon tax on it, or do cap and trade. And so at that level, for $25 a ton, nuclear now becomes a little, moves in the competitive range. And if you reduce the cost of capital, now we're, that was the original strategy. The problem with that, of course, is, whoops, that still requires a very large plant investment, you know, like $10 billion, and a potential uncertainty in how long it gets basically to do that. Then if you say, well, wait a minute now, if you look at, I don't know if you're, these are all the, we just went to the charts, and I don't know, you know, Mark, I don't know if you see there somewhere. Okay, but these are just a list of, these are publicly listed U.S. nuclear reactors. I don't know, there's some. If you sort of average out how much money they have, well, you get like 171st on the U.S. list, and the one slightly above it is Toys R Us. Okay, so these are not great big companies. All right, so it's very hard for them to lay out. Just for example, that's TVA, and EDF, you know, 58 reactors, but it's one company who happened to be owned by the government. Very different situation, and we're not about to change the way we do this. And the problem, of course, is this is really a good impedance match between the financial structure of the companies, private companies, and the large new reactors cost. So there are some areas, you know, where you've got a regulated market where you can move that to the ratepayer pretty quickly and so forth and so on, where this will basically save. So the idea of buying new ones is really tough. And you can't expect them to be running out, even if it's licensed and whatever, and, you know, paying for new reactors. So along comes these small modular reactors. And the idea, this is the potential, I'm going to try, of the rate of introduction, because I care about that, because it's a government, and the scale. So I have to think about both. There's 4 of these that people were talking about that fit this mold. This is the, you know, the current situation. But it also, there are some other advantages. One, these use commercial fuel. In fact, it's almost identical fuel, so you don't have to, that makes it a lot easier to license. Factory-built modules. Well, you don't have economy of scale. It's not clear that we've ever had economy of scale, but that's the story. But now you can build them in a factory, and you have a different paradigm there. You say, I build them in a factory. I've got, you know, the history of factories, if I do it well, is learning. They get better and better and better as time goes on. Quality control, and oh, by the way, if I look at many of the people that are in blue, is that these are the folks who've been doing this for the U.S. Navy now, which is probably one of the finest industrial bases that the world has ever seen, and they're already doing it. So we're not out of the nuclear business. We're out of the, if you will, just getting back in the commercial nuclear business, but BMW and so forth, Electric Boat, Newport News, they know what the hell they're doing. They can build these things. That's the game changer, okay? That says, this is very, very different than what we're doing before. Can you know, and it's that U.S. Navy industrial base, if you will. I'm saying, you know, I'm not starting this from zero, but it works for the government. It doesn't work for the commercial. How, you know, that's not necessarily so easy. This is the safety. These are new scale power. I mean, these things were designed from scratch to be safe. They were not designed to really produce power and then add safety. They're designed right. This is really a very different approach. This is a new scale one. You're probably familiar with this. What it amounts to is uses no, you know, what was the problem in Fukushima? Well, the pumps, you know, didn't get electricity. Well, these don't have pumps. You start up. It uses natural circulation. And there's a lot of water compared to the amount of it. So in fact, all the things that you concern yourself with are designed out of the system. So it's really very, very interesting. Empower is a similar design. You know, they also have calculated their, you know, PRA as well. So there are different approaches. What's the demand? Here are all the plants that are coal in this country, and you'll notice a lot of them are very old, and a lot of them aren't all that big. Now, they may not all be operating, but these are going to have to be basically replaced if you say, well, let me go to 500, half a gigawatt, and say over, you know, 1980, so, you know, that's over. It's going to be getting pretty old pretty soon, or, you know, there's a lot of market there basically across the board. Oak Ridge looked at some 25 plants in that basic area, you know, in terms of are they replaceable, you know, because you'd like to have them replaced, and they ended up saying, hey, they looked at the, like 2/3 of them, you could do it. In fact, some of them, it looked like you could do it relatively straightforward. So can you indeed, I mean, the key is, can you really become cost competitive? This is a curve that, and this is all fiction at this stage of the game, right? This is the uncertainty range in terms of, for natural gas, independent of how many plants you build. Well, wait a minute, suppose, and this is where some of the, I won't say it's fiction, but it's not, it's economics, okay, which is about as close to fiction as you can get. I hope I'm not insulting anybody here. But if you start off with $8,000 a kilowatt, which is, and say, all right, this is the amount of plants I build, and assume I've got 90% learning and go through the things, hey, you can become competitive after you build some, 8, 10 plants. And this is some work, the University of Chicago has been doing for the EIE. It's about as good as you can get, but we have data on this. In other words, the submarine people, both Electric Boat and Newport News, have demonstrated they can, on something as complicated as a submarine, they get 86% learning. The large aircraft business, Boeing, Lockheed, so forth, they get typically 85%. But nobody's built one of these before, but people who build very similar things said, this is within the, this is certainly not science fiction. But we've never done it before. Until we do it, we can't really promise very much about it. So let me get down to the other perspective, which really is another government, that's non-proliferation, which is a long-term, it's a long-term continuing issue. This is from the 1970s. Mike probably remembers some of this. Gee, this is an advertisement. Okay, nuclear answer. This was because the Shah was building, the Shah, Iran. Well, this is, that problem hasn't gone away, right? This is from this last month, right? This is what this is the enrichment plant, in Iran, and this is what the Grand Ayatollah says. See, to him, it is a religion. It's genuinely part of his religion, right? He says this is part of our national identity, and of course, this, the president doesn't think that's, and everybody else in the world doesn't think that's so great. So this is a problem that how one distinguishes civil work from military is a significant area. So we're going to be looking at that in some depth. The way you get at that, it really is through the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This again comes off the state line, and indeed, part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty says, hey, for those countries that abjure nuclear power for nuclear weapons, you're obligated to help them, basically do that. That's a hard issue to deal with. On the other hand, if we, again, you start putting some numbers in, if you say, well, wait a minute, if we're going to build enough SMRs to genuinely affect clean energy, we'll be building a lot. And if we're building a lot, that means we're going to be a major player in the international market. And that means we can help set the standards throughout that market. Just the same way we're hoping to set safety standards, you're also sending non-proliferation standards. These new SMRs that we talked about have non-proliferation. That's, you can build them in, you design that in terms of, basically in terms of those systems. So this is another opportunity where you've got a U.S. government, interest in making this happen. And as I say, that has to be embedded in this whole idea of an international fuel leasing regime. There's President Obama talking about that in the same speech. There's President Bush. Again, this is not, this again is an area where from a nonpartisan basis you have a strong possibility. There are other countries, as you know, all involved some way or another in terms of looking at these. Many of these are advanced type reactors beyond light water reactors, but a lot of them are light water reactors as well. So this is an idea who is coming all around, basically becoming all around. China in particular, I think, is very aggressive in this. Okay, so this again comes. This is like to be up to date. This is a talk given by by the president last week in wasn't North Korea, South Korea, right? Where we're talking about a national security. But as part of national security, again, investing in innovative technology so we can build the next generation of safe, clean plants. Guess what? Those are small modular reactors, and of course, this is the program that we're just starting. And this is the congressional, this is the congressional language that went into the budget. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. 67,000. This is the NP 210 program. That model for SMR, 67 million, licensing, first of a kind, design certification, utilizing. They're not being specific about what type of technology, but said you got to move quickly. You've got to be expeditious in how you basically do that. $500 million over. 500 million, $500 billion over the 5 years. So that's not, that'll cover more than a few lunches, I think. Okay, so that's where we're going. What am I here to do? Why am I talking? Secretary of Energy has put together an advisory board. That's really my interaction. I don't work for NE. For a subcommittee looking at small modular reactors. These are the members, and we're looking at two questions, right? Hey, wait a minute. Will U.S. leadership really help shape the entire global nuclear enterprise? Okay, both in terms of climate and in terms of non-proliferation. Those are areas where the government has a real responsibility. Where are these a program within the Department of Energy, within the Department of NE, or is this something really bigger than that? Is this something you want to get presidents, Congress really interested in? And then, number two, and that's specifically why I'm out here, is wait a minute, what government policies could lead from licensing, because that's all we're doing, to a deployed fleet? How do you go? Is just getting it licensed enough, or do you need more than that? And indeed, that's part of the reason I'm out here to discuss that, because the Department of Energy is not going to tell you that, but I believe region areas are going to have to say, wait a minute, we think we have some ideas on how to do that. This is what the Department of, the government ought to be doing. This is what we will do. How can we work together to basically make that happen? These are the members of the group. You'll notice one former P&L director, Bill Madia, is part of that. He also plays golf with the secretary. He's actually a better golfer than the secretary, so they play on the same team, which is, I think, important. I've got Admiral DeMars, who used to run the naval, who was the third after Rickover. Dick Meserve used to be head of the NRC. Bert Richter is a Nobel Prize winner, head of the Nuclear Energy Advisory Group. Jim Baker was the head of NOAA, the NOAA administration. He's now working for the Clinton Foundation. He's a really serious environmentalist in terms of numbers. Well, you probably know who most of those people are. And what we're trying to do is we have to report back to the Secretary in September, sort of answering those two questions. Okay. And of course that means we're not going back and looking at the current FOA. Of course, that's done deal. What do we need to do, if anything, beyond that? What does the government do? What should the potentially government do? How do we continue to interact with the, communities that would potentially use these? Okay, so this is then the way I would pull this together. This is again coming out of the president's. This is his vision, if you will, for doing that. I said this is what he is doing is relating nuclear energy, non-proliferation, and climate. So these things are connected together, and I think that's really very good. Notice clean energy, national security. Okay, how they, how they're both two sides, if you will, of the same coin. Again, these are the national goals. This is the strategy, which I think makes some sense. Hey, we're getting started at this. License at least 2 of these ultra-safe designs. Safety is really key to making this happen. But we have to develop the factories, because that's the thing that's going to drive the question out. How do you go from just licensing to an industry? Because that's what we're talking about. Okay, we have to be able to compete with natural gas. That doesn't mean you can't be, you don't have to be twice as, half the price of natural gas or something, but it's got to be enough so that you say, hey, I want a diversity of source, I want base load, this is a good way of doing it, I'm going to mix my portfolio and of that, SMRs, small modular reactors, fit within that envelope. And we don't know, ultimately we don't know that. And then, maybe the government can be a first user. Yeah. Again, that's particularly one of the reasons I came out here is, wait a minute, there's some real potential here, not just DOE with some real things, which use a lot of electricity, but DOD, in this whole area, can you put something together? Can you put a proposal that says, hey, this is what we're going to do, government, this is what you need to do, and this is how we do that, over and above just getting these things licensed, because you have to get enough of a market to build the factory, okay, to show that I can indeed drive the cost down. How do I get through that particular situation? And then the U.S., again, in terms of non-proliferation, can we become the global market leader using SMRs in nuclear technology across the board? Again, the timely goal is, 80% really pushes you into that. So I'm sort of still looking at that as the, as long as that's, as long as that's the administration's position, that's what we're going to sort of say is the timely goal. And underneath all of this, I'm saying, wait a minute, Fukushima is an opportunity to step back and say, wait a minute, where am I going from a world perspective? Can I create something that when you're all done, says, yes, I understand what Fukushima is about, I understand what the problems were, this gets you in nuclear, but I want to do something different. Is this different enough to make that, basically different, make that happen? That was indeed what happened with Sputnik when we decided, hey, wait a minute, we needed not just a Sputnik, but an Apollo and all the things that go with that. So that's a question, and that's where I'll leave it at that stage again, okay? So thank you very much.